Off we go.
It is.
Good morning. It's Wednesday, April 26, 2023. Time is 9:15. And this is the second segment of Natural Resources Energy's morning session. We are turning our attention now to Bill H31, enacting aquatic nuisance control. We haven't worked on the bill at all yet, so we're starting at the beginning. And Representative Bongartz has been kind enough to come down here to help us get started. Good morning.
Good morning.
So you could introduce us to the bill.
So for the record, I'm Representative Seth Bongartz. I am the sponsor of H31. I introduced the bill because I've become concerned about the amount of chemicals we're dumping into our lakes in connection with efforts to control usually irrational oil. I'm concerned that we're having little long-term impact on milk oil, and that once we start, the only way to maintain any impact that may have been achieved is to add more and more over time. I think we would all agree that the starting point for discussion about chemicals to the waters of the state of Vermont should be no. Then you can move on to a discussion of whether circumstances might exist to justify the application of chemicals in some carefully controlled circumstances. The current statute, and this is really what I want to get to in a minute and spend a little bit of time talking about. The current statute has a starting point of yes, as opposed to the precautionary principle of the starting point of no. And by the way, if you want to pull it up in advance, it's 10 VSA section 1455. So in 2009, we updated the former statute with 10 VSA section 1455, which revised the process for issuing aquatic nuisance control permits. Our awareness of the dangers of chemicals has increased ever since. In fact, two of the chemicals that we used until recently, Sonar and Renovate, have both now become disfavored.
Sorry, disfavored.
Disfavored.
Is that a term of art?
Yeah, that was the term that was used in the committee room by DEC, I believe.
Yeah.
And so now the new chemical that, of course, people are saying are safe. But we've also had some history on how the permits are issued since 2009, whether it's worked, whether it's had negative impacts on aquatic biota. And this is key, I think, although I fear we do not have nearly as much scientific analysis as we should. So we made the decision 13 years ago to reallow the use of chemicals. By the way, we were doing it before that as well. This is just modified. And I believe it's time to take a deep dive in order to assess whether doing so has been efficacious, whether there has been unintended collateral damage, risk we do not fully understand, and I think that's key, and whether we continue to believe there are circumstances where adding chemicals to the waters of the state of Vermont is a good idea. I want to be clear, I'm not prejudging, but I don't know the answer to those questions, but I do know, at least in my mind, that it's time to take a close look. And there's another level to this. One is the statute. The other one, the part that has me concerned, is that permits have several times been issued over the objections of Fish and Wildlife scientists. There's historically been, I'll even use the term a battle between DEC, which issues the permits, and Fish and Wildlife, with Fish and Wildlife usually not winning the day. That may be more because of the workings of the statute than ill will between the divisions of the agency. I think the statute really is the key here. The wording of the statute, that's, I believe, is the real problem. But just to play this out, from Fish and Wildlife, I want to give you a couple of examples. From Fish and Wildlife, in a memo dated April 7th, 2003, with regard to an application to treat Lake Ortonia and Burr Pond. Fish and Wildlife writes, the significant loss of fish habitat and cover in the form of submerged aquatic vegetation in recent lakes raises many concerns regarding the potential impact of fish populations. Suitable surveys of fish communities have not been conducted in lakes targeted for chemical control of Eurasian milk oil. And so the impacts of those chemical treatments may have on fish species of greatest conservation need is largely unknown. I have more that I don't want to just keep reading these, Steve. I'll read you another one. Then I'll read, these are a couple of older ones. I'll read you a couple of more recent. Fish and Wildlife. I'm opposed to a 10 parts per billion treatment level. This is regard to Lake St. Catherine, by the way. Past treatments in Vermont, approved at 6 parts per billion, have yet to be fully evaluated, in my opinion. Several questions remain as to the full impacts on the aquatic ecosystem from the treatment of this concentration. Furthermore, Lake St. Catherine's document itself states that the target dose of 10 parts per billion is likely to have significant impacts on certain non-target plants during the year of treatment. The follow-up statement that most native plants are expected to receive in 1 or 2 years is not very reassuring. Fish populations, as well as other aquatic organisms, are dependent on aquatic vegetation for food, cover, and ultimately survival. Yet between 2009 and 2018, 87,000 pounds of renovate were added to Lake Champlain. I'm sorry, Lake St. Catherine.
I'm sorry, could you say how many?
87,000.
Thank you.
And from April 2006, a different issue, the issues with Eurasian milfoil infestation of Vermont lakes and ponds arise from people who own property and live on these waters. They claim that swimming, boating, and fishing are negatively impacted by milfoil. We do not agree that angling quality is negatively impacted by the existence of Eurasian milfoil in the lake. Swimming and boating, however, can be easily improved through the use of localized bottom barriers, hand pulling, and mechanical harvesting to create boating channels and access to deeper water. While lake and spot herbicide treatments and the resulting widespread decline of fish habitat is unnecessary and generally futile, as Eurasian milfoil will never be suitably controlled. This is from Fish and Wildlife. Let me just give you more recent one. This one from 16. This one from much of it, they're all from the past. It's clear that continued this is about Lake Dunmore. It's clear that continued lake-wide suppression of Eurasian milfoil is ineffective in the long term and can negatively impact other recreational water uses such as anglers, not to mention the potential negative impacts on fish population through the removal of functional fish habitat. It's time that long-range management plan for milfoil control on lakes and on Vermont lakes begin taking into account angling and fish populations as important considerations. From 2021, I'm just going to put this out there from the start. I completely oppose the chemical treatment of any sorts in Lake Bombasine. This is Fish and Wildlife scientists, by the way. The Lake St. Catherine case has been nothing short of a disaster for warm water fish populations, and in particular largemouth bass fishing quality has declined enormously and not recovered because of the suppression of aquatic vegetation. So I think a couple things here to point out. One is, from what I can tell, even Fish and Wildlife, which is worried about this, is really talking only about fish. And nobody's really talking about reptiles, amphibians, aquatic biota. And I don't know, to what extent that, but that's not what we're hearing, and that's a real concern. So, and again, I want to go back to this. I think the real issue is the statute and the 5 criteria governing the issuance of permits. They're weak D. So, if you pull up, and let's try to read a little bit. Again, like I said, the starting point I believe, with 10 VSA section 1455, starting point is yes. The secretary shall issue a permit for the use of pesticides in the waters of the state for the control of nuisance aquatic plants, insects, and other aquatic life, including lamprey, where the applicant demonstrates that the secretary finds. So if the applicant demonstrates A, B, C, and D, they get a permit. The starting point is yes versus no. Shall not be issued unless would be. So, and let's just look at these. The first one is there's no reasonable non-chemical alternative. That sort of implies that it's a worthy thing to do in the first instance. And so, I just think that's problematic. There is acceptable risk to the non-targeted farm. I don't know what that means. Acceptable is a pretty loose term. There is negligible risk to public health. And then I'll just skip down to number 5. There is a public benefit to be achieved from the application of a pesticide, or in the case of, well, as long as there's no undue adverse impact from the public good. So it's a balancing test there on that number 5. And it's like the balancing test is between being able to dive off your dock and I don't know what. But where's aquatic biota? Where is reptiles? Where's amphibians, birds? So the balancing test is pretty loose in my view. So I think, and I'm not, so I'm been careful in this. I'm not being critical of DEC because I think this problem is the statute. And so this is what we are anticipating here with this bill is a summer study with a couple from the House, couple from the Senate, and 3 scientists, one from the Department of Health, one from Fish and Wildlife, and one from DEC, to just do a deep dive and, frankly, in my view, really look at the statute and really look at the, try to get as much as we can to the issue of safety. So I don't know which order you want to talk about it, or whether we would want to talk about it if we're going to do the summer study, but it's a combination of, is there PFAS in the chemical? I don't even know. What deep research do we really have on the safety of this? We've already in the past had 2 others that are now found to be disfavor with Sonar and Renovate. Now we have a 3rd. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but I think so. That's what's going on here. I just think it's time for a step back. It's been 13 years. We've learned a hell of a lot about chemicals and what the damage they can do. And so now the one thing I'll say is that the department has talked is in some sort of a bit of a, or has been a sort of a pre-rulemaking. And I would just suggest that rulemaking on a bad statute is a worth of time. I think what we need to do is look at the statute with the 3 scientists and 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate. So pretty simple, done by December 31st, I think, report due, and then it gets the legislature, positions the legislature to be able to act a year from now.
Senator Watson.
Thank you. I don't know if this is something you are familiar with, but what is the relationship between, so it's DEC that issues the permits, and the other group that I have in my head around pesticides is VPAC.
Oh.
And so does VPAC that's it. I'm not, am I correct in this?
You say PFAS.
No,
VPAC.
VPAC. Does VPAC have any authority in this situation where with these permits?
I believe it's all DEC.
It's all DC.
Okay.
Interesting.
But that's through ag.
The Agency of Agriculture is the home of pesticides. So, well, unfortunately, Mr. O'Grady wasn't available, but he would normally go right
Yes.
Bongarts to Mr. O'Grady, do a
Gotcha.
walkthrough and get on. He is coming in, but not
Okay.
until 11 o'clock.
Okay.
First week again. Do you have in the House testimony from both DEC and Agency of Agriculture?
We didn't have the Agency of Agriculture because they haven't been involved in this process. We had testimony from Fish and Wildlife and DEC.
I'm looking at the findings in 1451. So this is the original 2010, 2009. Agency of Agriculture, Food Markets, and the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation have established an informal working group to address invasive and noxious weeds, but additional authority is necessary for the agency and natural resources to adequately respond to its invasive aquatic nuisance species. So we'll want to chase that down and see what's happened since then. Since, as you say, it's 13 years. Learn to play. Senator Watson?
And I think this may also be a question for Mr. O'Grady, but I'm interested in if the group or if the House had any discussion about any like federal preemption on pesticide governance?
I,
Okay,
I have every sense we have the ability
okay,
to decide whether or not to allow them in our lakes.
okay.
Yeah.
On lakes, right.
So, by the way, I didn't mention this bill started off having a moratorium as well.
Yes.
And we left, and after a lot of testimony, we began to realize that was complicated. And we also decided that the study is relatively quick, back next year. There was enough controversy and some good testimony, but we took a lot, by the way, we took a ton of testimony on this. We spent a lot of time on this. And in the end, decided to just focus on this study, get done, and take it from there.
Okay, right, I was just gonna ask you about that part. So can you fill us in a little, the original bill was just an outright moratorium permanently on, or moratorium during a period of study?
Yes.
Okay, and then you decided rather than preempt the ability to have the current system continue operating during the period of study, we're letting the current system operate and doing the study. And next session, we revisit it in greater depth.
Yeah.
Okay,
For some, that was a little would prefer, some would prefer the moratorium, but it's a short enough time frame. I think just anyway, there was so much testimony and enough controversy and enough arguments on both sides about what the impacts of a moratorium would be, especially on lakes that had started different processes, that we just decided it's another. We've been doing it for 20-something years. Get through the summer and take it up next year.
okay. Anything else you think we ought to be aware of? All right.
Thank you, Chair Frank. Well, thank you so much for spending the time on this work. One of the things that has surprised me has been actually how little we seem to have about our waterways as it relates to the biodiversity bill that we just covered. So this feels like a compliment. I know that you didn't look at this in the bill as you've described, but we have constituents who feel strongly around like wake boating and boating in general. And I'm wondering if you would possibly see any germaneness to this bill with that conversation.
I think that I have to say in the session here. We haven't taken any testimony on that.
So this was, there was no connection
Definitely have my
between
own
the
views.
voting. Okay. So there was no testimony taken as it relates to like the voting piece. Okay, well, you know, I wanted to bring it up in case anyone from Windsor County is wondering.
Watching
Nearby
that.
orange.
Yeah,
Those are slow
listening
nature.
for the sound.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Senator McCormick.
Yep, as if the focus on the chemicals or on just the kind of the eutrophication of lakes more broadly.
It's really the use of chemicals.
Use of chemicals.
Short uses.
That they may have bad impacts. Because I wondered, same with you, with Eurasian milfoil. Is that, it is an invasive species.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Awful stuff.
But I also wonder about just in general, will you see a lake starting to get clogged with weeds? I think sometimes that's a natural process, right? The topography is not static.
Yeah, and we didn't get into that level of detail.
Okay.
By the way, just so you can have this in the back of your head, for milfoil, by the time you get to 20 feet in depth, the milfoil doesn't get that cool. So it's in areas that it's the shallower.
Oh.
Where-
Dewey's Pond. I mean, that's a huge issue.
I didn't really talk about it, but milfoil is awful stuff. It's like, it's like honeysuckle and knotweed and our forest. There's not a good solution here, but all the more reason to step back and take a look.
So the bill is not pro milfoil.
It's not.
Okay, no, I'm hearing, there are people.
No, I want to be clear. It really is like, it's a conundrum. it's like the conundrum we have in our forests. You know, do you spray even carefully for these things, and what effect does that have? And no, these are no easy answers. That's why the study.
Opposition to this initiative that I've gotten from constituents never defends the chemicals.
Yes.
It's just sort of educating me on how bad milfoil is. And the idea is milfoil's bad, therefore drop poison in a way. And I'm not sure I buy the argument.
And that is, you know, I don't want to overstate it, but that's kind of the starting point for the statute.
Yeah.
In my view. So,
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
thanks, everybody.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I have fun talking to Ellen.
Um, Thanks, Representative Bonner. Thank you. With that, I'd like to invite Commissioner Beeling to join us at the table. Morning, Commissioner.
Good morning. For the record, John Beeling, Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. Thanks for having me come in this morning. I guess I'm really just going to focus on the study. We vastly prefer this version of the bill to the moratorium. That we thought that was very problematic. So a couple of things I just want to kind of set the record straight. Eric Palmer from the Department of Fish and Wildlife did come in and testify in the House. I think this whole idea that there's this internal battle going on between Fish and Wildlife and DEC has really been overplayed. There are, you know, they have their own perspective on things, and they focus on, you know, fisheries. That's what they do. And to be clear, the crux of that argument has to do with what happens when you successfully remove these aquatic invasive species, right? Once you get a lot of these weeds out of these ponds and lakes, there are certain species that don't respond well, and there's certain species that do. So one of the emails that Representative Bongart's read had to do with largemouth bass. So yes, there has been a decline in largemouth. There's been an increase in smallmouth. So it's just one of these things. I think it's been overplayed, like, oh, we're just ramming these things through. We do not, and by the way, we don't start at yes. We don't start at yes. That's the way permits work. The secretary shall if you make these showings. And I'll tell you, just recently, someone didn't even get past the first criteria. They came in, they wanted to use chemical treatment in a private pond, and there was a reasonable non-chemical alternative available. We denied that permit. So if you can't make that showing, you don't get the permit. I'd also note that since 2019, we do not approve all whole lake treatments anymore. We decided that's not a good use of these applications. And that arose out of a specific permit that was denied. So we are taking into account these considerations. We do believe we don't want to use herbicides, but sometimes there was a really good presentation by the president of the Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds before the House. And she went through the process that they had to go through to apply it in their lake. And it was arduous and it was lengthy, and they tried to do non-chemical, and they spent years and years and years. And we worked with them every step of the way. And we want to avoid using herbicides, but sometimes that's really the most viable alternative. So I don't think the statute's broken. And honestly, I don't think we need a study. I think we need rulemaking. I think rulemaking will greatly improve this process. And that's why we started the pre-rulemaking process. It's a very complicated and very controversial issue. And we're trying to involve as many people as possible. And to me, if we do a study, we're going to come out, what it's going to say, you got to go to rulemaking. And so rulemaking is when we bring in all this information. If there's information out there, which by the way, I haven't seen, that we haven't seen about Procella. Our health department, Procella Core is the chemical that's really creating so much controversy. That's the permit. By the way, the Bomacene permit.
What does it do?
It's an herbicide, so that it targets the species, the Eurasian milfoil. So you apply it in very low concentrations. It's very specific to that plant. It doesn't persist in the environment as very short duration. It doesn't, like a lot of chemicals stick around for a long time. This stuff doesn't. Do we love it? No. But right now, it's the application that works the best, and it doesn't pose an unacceptable risk. I know no one likes that term, but that's a term that's thrown about all the time in my world.
An unacceptable risk.
Unacceptable risk, right?
So how about who does an assessment of impacts on non-target species? So great, we're getting rid of the milfoil, but how about all the bugs, critters, plants
Right.
that aren't the target?
So, okay, this is, I'm just gonna read to you from a summary we have specific to this chemical. This is really the basis for this bill. I'm gonna just use the trade name. Procelachlor is practically non-toxic on an acute basis to bees, reptiles, fish, birds, and mammals. Review of ecotoxicity studies based on maximum label rate of 50 parts per billion, that's where the concentration you apply that, indicates parent compound and degrade show toxicity levels well above the application rates used in aquatic environments. Therefore, the potential for acute risk to fish, invertebrates, amphibians, birds, and mammals is expected to be low. Chronic toxicity of concern will be short-lived with a rapid degradation in the environment and rapid dilution from spot application use patterns. So we're considering all of the potential impacts of this chemical on the environment, not just on fish.
Sure. And that you were quoting what, please?
This is from, it's from our own, this is internal, this is from an aquatic toxicologist. I can get you this document if you want. This is a man named Rick Levy, who's since retired. He's an environmental scientist, but he did this is based upon a range of studies. This wasn't just his work.
Yeah.
So he's like a peer review, not a peer review, but a document review, a literature review. So we looked at this very carefully. This is from March 16, 2022. I can supply this to Jude if you'd like.
Great, that would be great. Thanks so much. And prior to something arriving in Vermont for potential use, what's the process for vetting chemical period? Like,
So this
to
particular,
ensure that there's,
Right.
that it's non-toxic, or what we know, what kind of toxicities it has.
so from an ecological standpoint, the EPA is the reviewer for chemicals like procelachlor, and they've approved its use. Our health department also looks at all of these chemicals, and as you, I'm sure know, they tend to be very cautious when approving the use of any kind of chemical, and they set very low rates. And so I'm very comfortable working with them, but they're being very conservative in terms of whether or not this stuff could be harmful to humans.
Senator Watson?
Thank you. I think you might have just said this, but I want to make sure that I am clear that what you were just, I understood you were quoting from two different things just now. The first
Yeah.
it was from one
Yeah,
document.
yeah.
Because I thought I had heard you say that was from Procella themselves.
No, this is from our, a man named Rick Levy, who has since
Okay.
retired, but he's an ecotoxicologist.
Okay. And so the part about it's not impacting bees, invertebrates, etc. All of that comes from him.
Well, he's performing a literature review. He's not a
Okay.
scientist in a lab. He's a state employee. So what he did is he did a review of all the literature out there studying this chemical. Because these things are controversial everywhere.
Sure,
We're
sure.
not unique.
Yeah.
So lots of people look at these things and they really want to make sure. And believe me, this is, like I said, step one, is there a non-chemical alternative?
Mhm.
Step one. If there is, that's what we're gonna approve. It's only after you go through this whole list. And for some of these lakes, this is really the only viable alternative. It's either this or you just give up. And you say you're just gonna have pervasive Eurasian Gulf oil, and that's the way it is. So we don't start it. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, it's interesting, I suppose the findings aren't binding in chapter 50, aquatic use control, but it's interesting. Number 4 is the ability to initiate quickly a response to containing control of new aquatic species introduction before it can spread is critical to reduce future management costs and protect the integrity of Vermont's ecosystems. And then 5 is infestations of new aquatic species must be detected early and acted upon swiftly to minimize economic, social, and ecological impacts, as well as to increase the probability of a successful eradication effort. So it's a pretty aggressive stance that frankly I intend, until going back and looking at the full text, hadn't seen before. Yeah. Okay. Senator White, did you have
I had a question about what a literature review is compared to a peer review, but you explained it.
Yeah, peer review, literature goes through a peer review, right? So it's to get a scientific article published, it has to go through peer review, which means
yes.
fellow scientists look at it.
So
So
it's-
literature, he's looking at peer reviewed articles and gathering them, excuse me, and then drawing his own conclusions from those articles.
So would you say it's a lower bar than doing a peer reviewed study?
It's not a peer, it is not peer review. His
Yeah,
study
so
is
it's,
not peer reviewed.
it's him, it's an employee of the
Right,
state looking at a bunch of different scientific things and
Correct.
saying heads up or heads down. And this is one employee.
Right, but this is his job. I mean, this is what.
Oh,
asked him to do. Yeah.
I'm not trying to denigrate the work that this person is doing. I'm just trying to understand the process and understand if I feel,
Sure.
based on what I've heard from constituents, that meets the threshold for proper protection of our lakes.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate you
Yeah.
explaining that. And I know that you're working hard on this, and, you know, I'll just say, I think one of the frustrating things that, and I'm new to this committee, so I'm maybe not as used to it, but it just feels like every single time we bring up a concern, the response from the administration is, don't worry about it, we're on it, we got it covered, we're doing it. And then I hear from constituents, they're not on it, they're not doing it, and it's not covered. And so my job, or I feel part of our job, is to understand where the miscommunication is occurring. So while I respect your suggestion that this is unnecessary, I think it's also about perception as well as real actions. So I appreciate and respect what you're saying, but I think it makes sense why constituents have come to us and explained that maybe this one instance of an employee doing a literature review does not meet the threshold or standard for them having their concerns alleviated. And I actually think that this would be very helpful for the administration in writing some of those long-term miscommunications that seem to be popping up. So it does surprise me that this is not being embraced, because I see this as an opportunity rather than a disadvantage. But it sounds like you want to keep things in-house.
What I really want to see is rulemaking. I think there is a lot of room for improvement to this process.
Great.
I would totally agree with that. And I think rulemaking is the way to get there. I think just the way it's set up right now, it's very awkward. It makes our jobs extremely difficult. It's not, I don't like the way it works. And that was
The way it
why,
is right now.
no, the way the process works, the way not so much the statute, we don't have rules. Typically, when you have a statute like this, you have rules, and that really helps you in terms of implementation, making sure the public's informed, setting ground rules for, you know, what is the public good, all these different things, which I think that's, to me at least, I haven't heard as much concern about like health effects. It's that the process stinks. That's what people are frustrated by.
Yes.
It's like, we don't feel like we're being heard. And I get it. It's not a great process. I think we can drastically improve this process. Just to mention, we have a formal internal procedure with Fish and Wildlife and with the Department of Health, which lays out our respective roles. That should be part of the rule, right? That shouldn't just be part of our procedure. So we should really make so the public knows, here's what this means, here's how you do this. And so they, I hope, get some comfort, like this is not a rubber stamp. We really don't want to do this, but in our opinion, and I've got some very, very smart people working on this,
Yeah, you
there are times when this is the only alternative, and that's when you get the verdict.
When procedures developed, is there public notice and comment?
Yeah, procedures,
Yeah,
procedures, no.
no.
Yeah.
So I think that, the rulemaking you're proposing
That would
open that process up.
Absolutely.
There'd be notice and comment. Same call.
Thanks. I've mentioned to students often that in a legislative committee room, usually the witness knows more about the issue than any of the members of the committee, no matter what the issue is. I mean, we are legislators. Our job is to think about what policy ought to be, but increasingly that is becoming a scientific question. And we bring in the experts to give us the benefit of their expertise. And I think getting even deeper than the issue of the milfoil, and I'm a friend of this bill, but I want to support it for solid reasons. So to explore the full range here. My father was a science teacher. And as a little boy, anytime I asked him a question, his answer would start with, well, the accepted theory is, my friends got straight answers from their parents. Okay, And I would say, Daddy, I don't want to know the accepted theory. I want to know the truth. And he said, well, a lot of people believe if you're very good, when you die, you'll go to heaven. And Jesus will tell you the truth about everything. But all we have here stuck on earth with our mere human intelligence is reason. And the most disciplined form of reason is science. And he would say that what you get is through the scientific process, observation, conjecture, hypothesis, testing of hypothesis, testing of the test, peer review. Eventually, you'll get some hypotheses become the accepted theory. I think that often what's happening today is that there's a lot of stuff, maybe even done with people who have degrees, and it's done in white jackets, published, and it uses part or parts of the scientific process. And we see that in the debate about COVID vaccination, for example.
Oh, good point.
Okay, and I do my own research, meaning I ignore the established theory, I ignore the credentialed scientists. I go to the rat-infested slums of cyberspace. I find the craziest stuff I can find. That I believe. Okay, because I'm not gullible, like you people. In any case, what I'm getting at is, what's that?
Is there a question for our witnesses?
I thought I was gonna make a comment as other members of the committee.
Okay, no,
I'm sorry, I misunderstood the agenda. Given the fact that other members of the committee, including the chair, made comments, I had the misimpression that we were welcome to make comments. I'll stop. Certainly didn't mean to interfere with the chair's agenda.
Trying to keep us on track time-wise. We have a lot of witnesses this morning. So Commissioner, your recommendation is go to a rulemaking.
I would
Not
sort
a
of, but I do appreciate that Representative Barnhart took out the moratorium based upon the testimony. So I do appreciate that. I don't want to appear ingrateful because like that would have been very problematic for my department. I just mentioned I just sent you another document from Dr. Bose from the health department pertaining to their position on the cell phone.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Commissioner Woodley? Thanks so much.
Mr. Chair, just
Yes, Senator McDonald.
whenever rulemaking comes up, my answer is, what about the Black Gum Swamp?
Okay,
Where we've gone to rulemaking to protect a place that law calls for protection. And they make the rule and administration withdraws the rule at the last minute after it's been approved. So we're in some would say bottom mill foil back into the Stone Age, but I don't know what the answer is. My brothers would be, don't mess with Mother Nature.
Senator McDonald. With that, Mr. Groveman.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry that we're sort of pushing along.
Yep. No problem. So my name is John Groveman, for the record. I'm the Policy and Water Program Director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council. I'm here representing the NRC, but I submitted a couple of documents that are on the website. One is a letter of support for H31 from a number of groups that we work in coalition with that are part of what we call the Water Caucus. So CLF, the Connecticut River Conservancy, the Connecticut River Valley chapter of Trout Unlimited, Lake Champlain Committee, all signed in support of H31. So I just want to point that out. So that letter is on your website. And I also submitted a document that I'll talk about briefly as I go through my testimony, a letter to the stakeholder rulemaking group that Commissioner Beeling referenced. So So my background relevant to this, just really briefly, is obviously I'm the water program director of VNRC. I work on all kind of water quality issues, including the use of pesticides and herbicides in lakes to deal with invasive species like milfoil. I was twice an A&R attorney, once the general counsel, and I actually seen from the inside the processing of these permits and some of the disagreements internally about how to address applications for the use of these chemicals. So that informs my view of whether or not we really need to change the statute or go to rulemaking, which is, I think, the heart of the debate here. And I was the director of the Water Resources Board when we used to hear appeals of these permits. So, I worked with the board to hear appeals of the disputes surrounding these permits. So, fundamentally, this is just a dispute about how to address some of the issues related to the statute, which allows for the use of chemicals in our waters. And as Commissioner Reeling noted, I think we're in complete agreement that use of chemicals in our public waters is a really precarious thing to do and should be done with caution. And I think what Representative Bongartz was trying to get at when he talked about the precautionary principle, I just think we just have a disagreement with the agency that the statute is set up correctly. We agree with Representative Bongartz that the statute is really not set up to implement this precautionary conservative principle, which says that there could be unintended consequences of using chemicals to deal with an issue in our lakes and ponds, and we should only use these chemicals as a last resort, and that's the prism through which we should look at whether or not we're going to be approving these permits. I do think the way the statute is set up, the way Representative Bongartz walked through it, is it jumps right in. If it doesn't start with yes, it certainly starts with what are the alternatives. We think that's the wrong question. We think the first question should be, what's the problem? What is the problem that the milfoil or other invasives are causing? Sometimes the problem is people don't like it's swimming in milfoil. They just don't like the presence of it. It may not be an ecological problem. It may be, but not always. There's a whole variety of problems. And the way that we see the statute set up is that it just kind of accepts the problem. And then it says, okay, well, what's the best alternative? Is there, if we pulled it out manually, the invasive species, if we didn't use the chemical, how much would that cost? Almost always these chemicals are going to be cheaper. It's a lot cheaper to use a chemical than to use matting or manual means to deal with the invasive. So we just fundamentally think that we really need to have the study group that the House approved to really dive into the guts of the statute and see if we're asking the right questions and starting from the right place. I think it's important to note in terms of the precarious nature of using these chemicals that we've learned with PFAS, the unintended consequences of chemicals that people have no idea about for decades. And the industry, whether it's pesticides or other chemicals like PFAS, they have such a leg up. They're making the chemical, they're manufacturing the chemical, they're making really the representations and studying the effects and promoting the chemical because they want to sell it to be used. And so Procelicor is approved through a pesticide approval process at EPA. So is glyphosate, which is Roundup, right? And we've had debates. Roundup has been out there since I think the early 70s, and I don't think Roundup is safe. I wouldn't put that near the section of the Winooski River that I live on in Marshfield, but I could. Completely legal to do that. I think if we've learned nothing from the PFAS experience, that we should be really cautious about what the impacts of these chemicals could be that we can't see today sitting here when we use them. And I think that VNRC and the groups are working with, we just want the legislative group, you have the experts. The study group is DEC, Fish and Wildlife, Department of Health, along with legislators. So you'll have experts from the agencies and you'll have legislators that can really get into the gears of the statute. Again, are we asking the right questions? Are we taking the right approach? I don't think rulemaking will be able to solve that problem. So to that point, one of the documents that is on your website, I'm on the stakeholder group. I'm a member of the stakeholder group looking at potentially a rule, Commissioner Beeling referenced. And so are some of the other groups that signed on to the letter supporting H31. And we sent a letter to the DEC staff person who's running the group. I think you're going to hear from tomorrow, saying here's some issues that we would like the rulemaking group to take up. And I'm just going to run through them really quickly to make the point that several of these issues would require a statutory change. And this is just basically to make the argument that we need the study group to look at the statute. So issue number one is who approves these permits under the law. And this gets to Senator Watson's question comment earlier. This is a DEC permit. They approve the permit. There is no requirement in law that Fish and Wildlife be consulted or the Department of Health. DEC did just adopt a protocol that says that they will consult with those two departments. But we think that the statute should actually require Fish and Wildlife, Department of Health, and DEC approval. And that's a topic, when we made that comment, the stakeholder group is like, well, we have a protocol, but if you wanted to require all the agencies to sign off on a permit, that would require a statutory change. So that's an example of why I think we need this group. As an aside, I will say that when I worked for ANR in the past and at the Water Resources Board, I saw the disagreements, especially with Fish and Wildlife and DEC. I think DEC, based on my participation in the stakeholder group, is doing a better job right now in coordinating with Fish and Wildlife than it has in the past. But that depends on who's at ANR, like who the staff are. This is not in statute. It could be in a rule, I suppose, but I don't think the rule could actually require that Fish and Wildlife and the Health Department sign off in order to actually issue the permits. I think that would be a statutory change. So I think we can't rely on whether it's procedures or practices or protocols or even rules. I think we need to look at the statute. Another issue that we raised in this letter is, and this actually I think relates to the discussion we had about high quality waters earlier in the session. There's some really high quality ponds. In fact, some of the ponds that were driving the debate about the 1,000-gallon limit and whether we, there are lake associations that said, hey, we have a high quality water. We don't want, we want it to be a Class A water, but we've got this 1,000-gallon limit. Some of those lake association people might want a petition to say, we don't want chemicals used in our water. We have a problem with an invasive species. We're so pristine. We want to make sure preemptively that no one can come around and petition. And by the way, I think it only takes one person to petition to use a chemical to start the process. So we thought it would be sort of parity to change the statute to say maybe there should be an ability to petition not to use chemicals in waters. We've raised this with the stakeholder group. We had an interesting discussion about the merits of that policy, but it was clear that that would be a statutory change. Like if that policy was to go into effect, ANR couldn't do that through rulemaking. That would really need to be a change in the statute allowing for that sort of petition process. And then the last issue I'll raise is I think it would require a change in the statute. We raised the issue that I mentioned earlier, that we should start with what is the problem and basically make it clear that the use of chemicals should be to address ecological problems, not recreational issues, and it should be a last resort. And that would require a reworking of the statute. If the rule could create clarity around the process, and it could create clarity around some of the terms about, acceptable risk and negligible impact, but it can't rework the whole statutory prism that we're looking at when we're deciding whether to use these chemicals. So I think fundamentally, this committee just needs to basically, there's a disagreement between the administration and some of the advocates about whether or not, we need the study group to change the statute. We think you do. And we're here, so I'm here to ask you to pass H31 as it's come to you, let the study group go forward so we could dig in and do the work to improve this process. And that's my testimony. I'm happy to answer any questions.
My question is a little late because Senator Representative Bongartz is gone. I'm just looking at the membership of the committee. There's interesting that there's the commissioner is not a member of the committee, but the commissioner calls the first meeting. So
I think it says DC or ANR, but I'm sure Commissioner Beeling would be very happy if that's it on the committee.
okay, well, that's a logistical detail. Okay, any questions? Well, since you've worked in this area and you're a lawyer, that the role of these findings at the beginning, this is a Michael Reed question as well, but the role of the findings in chapter 50 is assumptions being made explicit about what follows that's actually statute. And it surprises me how oriented they are to taking action.
Yes, the findings that are in the existing law. I'm not sure I understand the question. Or in the bill.
So, you know, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, when Mr. O'Grady comes in.
Yeah. I mean, you know, generally speaking, and we had this debate a little bit again with the high quality waters bill is, you know, findings are helpful in context, but they're not really, the law is the statute, the criteria. And that's what DEC follows when they implement it. And as Representative Bongartz they go right to step one, which is either a reasonable alternative. And that's, you know, begins the review.
So all the review is for a chemical to be allowed into the state to begin with, it's EPA approval that's required.
Yeah, it looks like in this situation, it's a pesticide. So it goes through an EPA pesticide approval process where they register the pesticide basically. But again, you know, they registered glyphosate and many other pesticides, and we have a raging debate about whether that approval should have been allowed in Europe. As you know, we've had this conversation with the toxic issues. They have banned some of these chemicals. I think the industry in our country is at such an advantage over the meager resources that even EPA has to be back on their heels. To, you know, they get the studies, they get all of the work from the industry, and you know, who wants to put the chemical into commerce and to make money off it. So I think, you know, it's instructive that there were two other pesticides that were used, as Representative Bongartz mentioned earlier. We don't use them anymore because they were found to be more harmful than we thought and not as effective. And so this is like the third generation, I think, of these chemicals. And now this is what we're using now. So, I mean, I think we have the EPA's registration of these pesticides, but again, I don't think there's disagreement that from the agency that I'm hearing, like, no one feels good about using these chemicals in our public waters, right? I think it's a matter about, even if the pesticide has been registered, we should, if there's an ecological problem that's so severe that we need to use these chemicals, that should be the only circumstances when we should use them. That's our policy point of view, but I think that would be what the legislative study group would get at, right? Is there agreement on that? And what is the standard that should be created to, is it the standard that I just articulated, or maybe something else? But that's not how we read the statute now. Statute definitely, this is an EPA approved pesticide. Are there alternatives? Doesn't really look at the problem.
Are you familiar enough with the EPA protocol to be able to comment on how robust?
You know, I really haven't ever looked at, I'll be honest, on their pesticide approval, you know, process, like in detail and what's involved with that. But I just know generally that they're back on their heels because they just are, just like our agency, you know, understaffed, under-resourced. The industry puts a lot of money and effort into getting these chemicals approved and out there. And as you know, for the PFAS discussions, where usually it's only after the fact when problems emerge, then we scramble around and do we regulate the chemical? Do we ban it? So it seems like it's part of the backwards process, I think, we have in this country in terms of being overly liberal and allowing chemicals out there into commerce.
Any questions for Mr. Groveman? Thanks very
No,
much.
thank you
Good
for the
to see
time.
again.
Thank you.
We'll go to our remote witness, Mr. Stannard, or representative, former representative emeritus. Stannard.
Bob.
Bob.
I'm being told that you'll need to unmute yourself and turn on your video. And nothing yet. So Mr. Stannard, I don't know if you're there still, or we're just seeing your placeholder.
Yes, I'm trying to unmute and I'm trying to get my video over. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're unmuted, so we're halfway there already.
I think Judith might have to undo my video.
Okay, we're double checking here.
She, and it was probably good judgment on her part because I'm not all that good looking.
Just needs to click on that icon at the bottom.
Says I can't start because the host has disabled my video.
If you right click on his name, does it give you an option to invite him to, oh no, it doesn't.
It just says ask to unmute.
Well, somehow we've turned video back on our side. Have you, so you're clicking on turn on video and it won't let you do it.
Huh? No, it's, I'm still getting the message that I've been disabled.
We should leave and
Come back in.
rejoin.
Yeah, that's what you should do.
Well, so you want to, maybe the easiest thing is drop the link and reuse the link. back.
So I will leave and I'll be right back. Don't go away.
We'll be
We
waiting
will-
right here.
Bated breath.
Geez, it won't even let me leave. This is bizarre.
It's funny. Life in the Zoomiverse.
So we have an hour-long break today?
Not really, not now. Well,
Well, we took that quick break before starting, so after Mr. Stannard and before Mr. O'Grady comes, we'll take a break.
here he is.
Hey, look at me.
You are-
How's
Good
that?
morning. Perfection.
How do I look?
Uh,
All right,
Naked.
no
without your-
comment. Let's save that for the questions later on. Am I ready? Are you guys ready?
Yes, the floor is yours. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Senator Bray, for allowing me to speak today. I want to thank you and the committee for agreeing to take up this important bill. And before I go any further, I would like to thank Judith Newman for all of her work and herding the cats on my side. Thank you, Judith. For the record, my name is Bob Stannard. I am a former member of the House and I did work in the building there for many years as a lobbyist. On May 14th at 10:27 p.m., I had retired when Shap Smith leveled the gavel and ended the session. And my plans were to fade away, go fishing, and mind my own business. Those plans fell apart about a year and a half ago when I learned that the Lake Bomazene Association Board and the town of Hubbardton had filed an application to use toxic chemicals to kill milfoil in the lake where I've been fishing, Lake Bomazene. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out just what the problem is and why this would be necessary to do. In the meantime, I've learned a lot about 10 VSA, subsection 1455, and how the statute works, or I might say doesn't work. There's practically no more milfoil in Bomazene today than there was a quarter of a century ago when the Water Resources Board declared in their findings that there were 600 acres of milfoil. Today, there is theoretically 620, but I think people would say that there's even less than that. According to the fish and wildlife scientist biologist who oversees this lake, milfoil has been remarkably stable over the last quarter of a century. To this day, there's never been an adequate answer as to what the need is for this application to spray Lake Bomazeen. I would like to say before I go on that I am proud to stand with Vermont's environmental community in support of H31. And before I get into the testimony that I had sent to you folks, I would like to address some comments that I've heard this morning, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes, please.
Commissioner Bailing had said that the conflict between Fish and Wildlife and DEC has been overplayed. I think one needs to only talk to the scientist biologist that oversees the western part of Vermont and to read the correspondence between the permit specialists and the fish biologist to come to agree that it has not been overplayed. It is a real situation. There are a lot of documents out there that show that there's been tension between the two divisions. He said that they don't do whole lake treatment, but if you were to look at the Bomazeen permit, they intend to do the entire littoral zone over 600 acres. And I'm going to be very hard pressed to think that when you put a liquid in one place, that it stays in that one place and does not leach out to the rest of the lake. I will let other experts explain to me how when you put a liquid in another liquid that it stays put. I don't believe that it does. If you were to read about Procelicor, you would see that it does not just kill milfoil, it does kill other non-targeted plants. Perhaps most importantly about the debate about Procelicor is that there is no long-term data on Procelicor. It's been around for about 3.5 to 4 years. I heard Mr. Grobman say that, what we do is we okay these chemicals and then decades later we find out that they aren't working for us, and that's when it's too late. Right now, there is no long-term data on Procelicor. And Procelicor, just so you're clear, has not ever been approved by the EPA. It has been registered by the EPA. And you will be receiving testimony from Dr. Cynthia Moulton, who I had hoped was going to be able to testify in these proceedings, but somehow she got bumped. She's going to be sending you her testimony. She worked for the EPA for years, and she knows more. She'll forget more about this process with the EPA than I will ever hope to know. Mr. Bailing is correct in that the first criteria that needs to be looked at before a permit is issued is whether there's a non-chemical alternative. However, when there are times when a non-chemical alternative may be too expensive, then they fall back on using chemicals. So, and what determines whether a non-chemical alternative is viable is left up to the one person who does the permitting for this procedure. Regarding their proposed rules, I would simply say that 10 VSA came into being in 1978. It was revised in 2010, and that they've had 13 years to write rules for this law. And for whatever reason, they've decided to start doing it this past December. And before I go on to my stated comments, I will say that if a law works for some, they really like it. If it doesn't work for some, they don't like it. If a law works for everybody, there wouldn't be a hearing here today. So the current law was passed with good intentions. It was designed to address invasive species Eurasian milfoil. Current law does not allow for input on the impact of the use of chemicals on our fish and wildlife. It strictly looks at the invasive species that they're trying to kill. The DEC is in total control of this process. They may reach out to other agencies for input, but they are under no statutory obligation to accept their input. In December, well, I just mentioned this, in December, they've begun the process of promulgating rules. Rules are not the answer. They cannot fix the flaws in the law that you've already heard from Mr. Grobman, by the way. For many years, the Fish and Wildlife Department has raised concerns about the use of chemicals only to be overruled by the DEC. The current law allows for only one person to file an application and begin the permitting process. The public may be afforded an opportunity to weigh in, but the DEC is under no statutory obligation to accept the public's or a municipality's concern. The law needs to be changed to allow for a more formal role of the other agencies in the permitting process and to provide more clarity. The only way to address the flaws would be to pass H31 and create this study committee as being proposed to review current law, to receive public input, and recommend changes to the law. Now, I would argue that a limited moratorium on issuing any new permits beginning January 1st of this year, or you can start it today as far as that goes, would be an appropriate action to take for this committee. It seems a little bizarre to me that we would continue to issue permits under a statute that most of us feel needs some work. So I just throw that out there. We need a law that works for all Vermonters, not just the few who serve on these lake association boards. I would ask, why would anyone fear a review of the existing law? It doesn't seem to be a big threat to me. The study committee would determine whether or not there was a need for changes to the law. Then it would be up to you to decide on the recommendations that this is a fair process. This can only be done by passing H31. Now, tomorrow you're going to be hearing from the Lake Bomazene Association board member. The process that this board used in promoting its application to use toxic chemicals to kill milfoil in Lake Bomazene was to ignore their membership, to ignore the 4 municipalities, i.e. the town of Castleton, Hubbardton, Fairhaven, and Shrewsbury, that voted against their application. And in response to a presentation by Mr. Lindsay Waterhouse, the town of Fairhaven voted against the application twice. And ignore the 3,500 people who have signed petitions in opposition to the application. The board has been successful. This is the Lake Bomazene board, by the way, has been successful in alienating the town of Hubbardton to the degree that in their annual report this year, the Hubbardton Select Board declared that the town will no longer financially support the Lake Bomazene Association and or the Lake Bomazene Preservation Trust, which is a group that's made up of only 5 people. Neither the LBA nor the LBPT has ever held a public forum on their application. They've never discussed the need to use chemicals in Lake Bomazene. Both organizations have lost the faith and the confidence of the local community and the 4 municipalities. The current law allows for a process that marginalizes the public as well as the Fish and Wildlife Department and favors the few who make up these lake associations. This is why we need H31 now. A week ago, the Vermont Senate, I don't need to tell you this, but I will, voted favorably on S25, which is a bill designed to keep chemicals known as PFAS out of skincare products. That was a wonderful thing, and I commend you for doing that. Vermonters are more and more concerned each and every day about the perils of chemicals that we are using. It's time that we rethink our chemical use in our state's waters, and H31 is the best way to address this. And I've attached in my below the copy of the Fish and Wildlife to the Lake Bomazene. And I will point out that the DEC is at liberty to not accept any of the comments or recommendations from the Fish and Wildlife. The process is in the hands of the DEC, and that's where it stays. They can get opinions, but they are not obligated to implement them or even acknowledge them. Once again, I want to thank you for letting me speak today. And in closing, I just want to say one thing, and that is about the 5 criteria. The last criteria is there a public benefit? The reason I'm here today and the reason I believe this law needs to be changed is when I read that, I said, as a former legislator and a lobbyist, what the heck does that even mean? Is there a public benefit? I could make an argument, and I will, since I've got another minute left, that if I'm driving 100 miles an hour, there is a public benefit, for me at least, of getting where I'm going very quickly. Conversely, if I am driving 25 miles an hour, there is also a public benefit because I'm driving safely. That's how ambiguous and nebulous the criteria is that is being used today to issue our permits. Anyone can read whatever they want into the criteria and justify their actions. We need H31. Again, Mr. Chair and the committee, I want to thank you for taking this bill up. I do hope that you will vote favorably on it. I also hope that you will give a modicum of consideration to a mini moratorium, at the very least, halting any permits between now and the time the study committee has completed its work. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here. It's nice to see some old friends and to see some new ones as well. And I'll take any questions if you dare ask.
All right, well, I'll start with an easy question. I'm trying to figure out the public benefit of you going 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Get off the road.
I get to where I'm going very fast.
All right.
And by the way, let me just state for the record, just so there's no misinterpretations, I am not advocating that we drive 100 miles an hour unless it's me and my BMW and it's dark and there's nobody around. But anyway.
Oh my God.
No, I'm not doing that. No.
Senator White.
Thank you, Chair Bray. Thank you so much for joining us today. My question is, you just noted I understand you're in favor of the moratorium, but we don't have that in the bill as it's currently presented. But then you also noted that you would like us to delay the permitting process. I'm wondering, is there a distinction between, is there a barrier between moratorium and what you're suggesting? Because I am partial to the idea of us waiting until there is further assessment before we allow for these further permits. Although I think that might bungle all of the great compromise work that was done in the House. So I'm trying to understand if there is a medium and a delta between the two of those things.
Well, thank you very much for that question. Originally, the bill had a moratorium on any and all permits, period. That was permits that are currently existing and that would require more attention over the next year. That didn't go anywhere in the House. And I understand why it wouldn't, because there are permits that are in place and people are counting on them, blah, blah, blah. However, to the best of my knowledge, with the one exception of the permit that Mr. Bailing referenced earlier, that was denied for a private individual to put chemicals in his pond, I don't believe that there's any other permits that have been issued. So what I'm advocating, Senator, is that if H31 goes forward, it certainly makes sense to me that the department would, at the very least, put the permits that are being applied for now that have yet to be issued, to put them on hold until this work has been completed and we can see where we're going to land. You can call it a moratorium, or you can call it putting the process of issuing permits on hold, whatever you want. I'm not wed to the word moratorium, but I am advocating that I just think it makes sense that if this bill does go forward, that maybe a letter from the committee suggesting that the department put their future permits on hold until this work is completed, that might suffice. So maybe it does not need to be in the bill. It could be as simple as a letter from this committee, maybe jointly with the House committee, advocating that the process be put on hold for the time being.
I mean, Mr. Chair, I think that that's a lovely suggestion. I've never been a part of a committee that has done that before. So would be interested in exploring that conversation further, but I don't actually know what that looks like, so.
Okay. I,
Well, let me just respond by saying in my 4 years that I spent on the House Appropriations Committee, we sent dozens of letters to various departments to make it eminently clear what our legislative intent was in the authorization of spending. So I don't think that that the idea of a letter is anything that's out of the norm for the legislature.
Sure. And so just to make sure I'm following, when you say a letter of intent, or stating in legislative intent, what letter are you suggesting the legislature send to whom, to what effect right now? Are you talking about implementing a moratorium through a letter of intent? Is that your proposal?
So my suggestion would be, should you take positive action on this study, which hopefully you will do, even after hearing all the testimony, it will make sense that you move forward, that upon passage of the bill, once that process has been completed and we know that it has been signed by the governor and it's now law and that this goes forward, at that stage, then a letter from your committee and perhaps the House committee as well, just so stating that it makes eminent sense that no permits be issued until the study committee has done its work. It's that simple. I think it would just come from the committee, and it can be just a recommendation. I presume that the department or the agency can say, thank you very much. We have a wastebasket for that comment and throw it away. I don't think that would be well advised, however, if I was lobbying on behalf of the agency. It just seems to me that if we're going to study a law and make some revisions to it, that wouldn't it make sense that we not be issuing permits for the next few months under the existing law that raises concerns with many people? That's all.
Okay, great, thanks. I just wanted to understand the letter part because it seemed like, for me, at least, a sort of a novel suggestion.
Yeah.
All right, any other committee questions for Representative Emeritus Standard?
That's wow. Boy, does that make me feel old?
Well, you retired at 44, so I don't know what you're.
Oh my goodness, isn't that lovely? Thank you so much. Oh my God, I'll send you flowers. Nice seeing all you folks, and thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Oh, and one quick check-in. So you mentioned, I think, we had trouble trying to there were many names, and we have much constrained time. So I'm not sure exactly where Ms. Moulton's, how she did or did not make it onto our list, but that would fall on me. But is the name Priscilla Moulton? And she's a retired EPA employee?
Her name is Cynthia Moulton,
Cynthia
and
Moulton.
she is a professor at Castleton University who previously worked at the EPA. She was on my initial list that I sent in some time ago, and I know that there's been a lot of back and forth on that list, and these things happen. There's nobody to blame. I don't worry about that. But I did reach out to her this morning and ask that she send her written comments to your committee as soon as she can.
Yeah, great.
So that might be the best way to resolve that.
Right. I was hoping we could at least get her written testimony that she delivered in the House side.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Great. All right. So yeah, so you've already made that request of her?
I did. Yes, I did while Mr. Groveman was speaking.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. All
yes.
Right. So any other committee questions for Mr. Standard? Seeing none, then we're going to take our long deferred break. And Mr. O'Grady is coming in at 11 to do the bill walkthrough.